Welcome in, everybody, to a deep dive. Well, it's a tough one. It really is. We're looking into a case out of Delaware, and
Uh-huh.
it's the story of Dimary Vásquez.
I see.
And right off the bat, what's really struck me about this case is the nature of the sources that we're working with.
Hmm.
We've got a YouTube true crime episode, which is interesting enough,
Right.
but then we've also got these fragments of a Spanish text.
Okay.
Um, And it feels especially poignant, I think, given what we know about Dimary's background, which we'll get into.
Yeah, it's like we're catching these little
Yeah,
pieces of a
yeah.
life more than getting the full picture right up front.
Right. And, speaking of things that are a little unexpected, Delaware itself.
Yes.
When you think about Delaware, you don't necessarily think about the
Yeah,
things that we're going to be talking about today.
it's true.
But this Spanish text really kind of highlights this interesting contrast we see in the state between its small size and its surprisingly diverse population.
That's one of the things that's so fascinating about Delaware. You
Yeah.
picture kind of small town America,
Yeah.
and in some ways it is, but then you have this incredible mix of cultures,
Yeah.
backgrounds, immigration stories. It all kind of collides in this one little state.
And does it make you wonder how those dynamics play out
Oh,
in
absolutely.
a system like the legal system?
Especially in the legal system, right?
Right.
You have to wonder, are things different for someone in Dimary's situation?
Yeah.
Because of those factors, language barriers,
Mm.
cultural nuances, even unconscious bias. These are tough questions,
Yeah.
but we have to ask them.
And I think that's what makes this case so compelling, because on the one hand, you have the tragedy of domestic violence, which is something that sadly is universal.
Right. It can happen anywhere to anyone.
But then you have this other layer of, is there something about Dimary's experience within that system that
Yeah.
might have been shaped by these larger forces?
Exactly. And that's what makes this more than just a crime story. It becomes a question of systemic issues, social factors.
Right.
How do we protect the most vulnerable among us?
And are we doing enough?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that struck me as we were looking into this is how widespread domestic violence really is. This isn't just,
It's not an isolated incident.
no, this is a much bigger problem.
Absolutely. The statistics are alarming, and even those numbers only tell part of the story.
Yeah.
Right. Think about how many people suffer in silence
Oh, I'm sure.
because of fear or shame, or maybe they don't trust the system to help them. And that's why I think these stories, even the tough ones, are so important to unpack,
Yeah.
to understand just how complicated this issue really is.
It's like we've got these two different lenses we're trying to look at this through,
Yeah.
and each one is just giving us a partial view.
Yeah.
But let's try to piece together what we can about Dimary's life from what we've got.
Oh,
The YouTube video, it's interesting because it gives us these really specific details, but in that classic true crime way, it's very focused on the crime itself.
right. It's about the facts of the case.
Right. And so it describes how Dimary was attacked while she was coming home from the gym. And that detail just, I don't know why, but it just really struck me. You're just thinking about her routine, her life. She's taking care of herself, going to the gym, and then to have this happen.
And in the parking lot of her own apartment complex, too.
Right. In that space that should feel safe
Exactly.
with her kids inside.
Oh, my gosh.
And that just adds this whole other layer to it, right?
It's awful, and it really highlights that sense of vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Because if it can happen there, where can you feel safe?
And then you've got these other details that we've managed to pull from both sources,
Right.
We know that Dimary was Puerto Rican from Bayamon, loved fitness, and she had kids.
Right.
Her oldest was only 14 at the time.
14 years old, that's just heartbreaking.
It is. And I think about her family and what they must have gone through.
And that's where the Spanish text, even though it's so fragmented, it really adds something important. It
Mhm.
mentions surviving family members, parents, siblings, even a grandmother.
Right.
It reminds you that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a woman with a life with people who loved her.
And those relationships matter.
They do.
It's so easy to get caught up in the details of a case like this, but we have to remember that there are real people.
Absolutely. Real lives forever changed by this tragedy.
And I feel like that's something that the YouTube video, with its very, kind of detached true crime style, almost misses.
I see what you mean. It's like it's trying to fit this story into a certain mold.
Right.
And in doing so, it loses some of the human element.
Yeah, and that's why I think having both of these sources is so important, because they each tell a different part of the story. Exactly.
It's about getting different perspectives to really grasp the complexity of what happened.
So we have this picture of Dimary, her life in Delaware, and then it's just gone.
It's tragic.
And it makes you think about what comes next, how do you even begin to find justice in a situation like this?
Right, and that's the question, isn't it?
The YouTube video kind of glosses over the legal proceedings. It says that her ex-husband was charged with first-degree murder.
Which makes sense on the surface,
Right.
given what we know.
But then it mentions this plea deal,
Hmm.
and he ends up with a sentence of 15 years to life.
Yeah, that's where things get really complicated.
And honestly, my first reaction was 15 years.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It doesn't feel like enough.
It's understandable to feel that way.
When you think about what happened and the fact that Dimary's future was taken from her.
Right, it's hard to reconcile that loss with any kind of legal outcome.
So help me understand this a little better. Why would there even be a plea deal in a case like this?
Well, you have to remember, there are a lot of factors at play. The prosecution has to consider the strength of their case, the impact of a trial on the family.
Especially the kids.
Exactly, putting them through that kind of ordeal, testifying, reliving that trauma, is a huge decision.
And there's no guarantee of a guilty verdict even with a trial, right?
That's the thing, and I think sometimes a plea deal, even if the sentence feels inadequate, it's seen as the more certain outcome.
I see.
It's a way to hold the perpetrator accountable without the risk of them walking free.
And that detail from the Spanish text about Dimary's birthday, it just really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah.
It mentions that she would have been celebrating her 35th birthday not long after she was murdered.
Or birthdays, anniversaries. Those milestones, they just hit differently when someone is robbed of their future.
It really puts a human face on the tragedy, doesn't it?
It does, and it makes you realize that justice, it's not just about legal proceedings and prison sentences.
No, it's about so much more.
It's about creating a world where this doesn't happen in the first place.
Exactly. A world where women like Dimary feel safe, supported, empowered to leave dangerous situations without fear.
And where those birthdays can be celebrated, not mourned.
Well said.
This has been a really heavy one, but I think an important one.
I agree. These conversations are never easy, but they're so crucial.
If anything in Dimary's story resonated with you, or if you are someone you know needs help, please reach out. We'll have resources listed in the show notes.
And remember, you're not alone. There are people who care and want to help. Thank you for joining us for this incredibly important conversation.